Hi, how are you? Today we're going to talk about embalming practices in Islamic history and how, oddly enough, they were far more horrific than you might think. But before we get started, I urge you to settle in, turn off the snuggle light, and get ready to relax because this story will lull you to sleep. Oh, and if you like it, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. Now let's relax and hear a little about the past. Imagine yourself walking through the dusty streets of an ancient Muslim city, with the warm breeze carrying the sweet and pungent aroma of spices. Around him, merchants shout offers while passers-by hurry to their chores. Among them, one issue arises: death. It's not something far away, but very close, with intricate rituals that try to ensure that the body not only preserves itself, but also connects to the divine after the end. Embalming a body in the Islamic world was an art, a necessity, and in many cases an act deeply rooted in religion and beliefs about the afterlife. Now imagine that you are in front of a body prepared for burial, but the preservation process is not like the one we know today. There are no sterile vials or advanced techniques. Instead, the Islamic embalming of antiquity was largely based on simple but effective methods to ensure that the soul of the deceased had a chance to enter a pristine paradise. However, the process, far from perfect, was, well, horrible. Death, in the historical Islamic world, was not just a physical end, but a transition, and embalming, or the preservation of the body, was seen as a way to ensure that the body was ready for the final judgment, where it would be resurrected. But the methods used were, to say the least, macabre. The process often involved the use of substances such as natron, a mixture of salts that dried out and dehydrated the body, removing any trace of life. This was not a smooth process, and in some cases, it could be fatal for the embalmer himself. Embalming, deep down, seemed more like a constant struggle against the inevitable than a religious practice. But for many, it was part of the natural cycle of life and death. Let's take a deeper step in this process. Imagine yourself walking into a stuffy room filled with strange odors, a mix of resins, chemicals, and the decaying fragrance of the human body. Islamic embalming techniques were rudimentary, often frightening and frankly chilling. It was not a simple preservation process, but a ritual full of mysteries and difficulties. The basic method involved removing the internal organs, drying the body, and applying resins and aromatic substances. First, the embalmers carefully opened the abdomen, removing organs such as the liver and lungs, and in some cases, the intestines. These organs were treated in a special way and often left aside or, at certain times, wrapped in cloths for preservation. The heart, in particular, was treated with a kind of reverence. It was considered the center of the soul, and its preservation or removal had a profound meaning for Muslims at the time. The lack of proper medical knowledge made the removal of these organs more of an art than a science, with many embalmers relying on techniques passed down from generation to generation, rather than evidence-based practices. One of the most commonly used substances during embalming was natron, a combination of dry salts that had the power to effectively dehydrate the body. However, its application was not without risk. Imagine the incessant work of rubbing these salts into the cavities and joints of the deceased, while the smell of the substance filled the room. The utilization of other substances, such as resins and scented oils, was intended not only to preserve the body, but also to ensure that it remained suitable for the spiritual journey that Muslims believed would come after death. The bodies were embalmed in large bathtubs or on stone surfaces, where specialists worked frantically, often in precarious conditions. There was not the precision and care that we imagine today with bodies, and embalmers faced difficulties such as the lack of light, the exhausting heat, and the unhealthy environment. Even more impressive was the fact that, after this whole process, the body was not in perfect condition. The preservation was temporary and the body continued to decompose over time. The work was arduous, without any guarantee that the process would be a complete success. So what was gained from this? Perhaps it was more of an attempt to make death more palatable, or a genuine belief that the body should be in good condition for the encounter with the Creator. But in reality, this whole effort seemed to be a fight against the inevitable, decomposition. And that, of course, wasn't pretty to look at. Now, let's explore a fascinating aspect: the way Islamic funerary practices influenced embalming. When we talk about death in the Islamic context, we are dealing with a highly spiritualized and ritualistic view of the end of life. For many, death was not the end, but a transition to another existence. And the body? Well, the body played a very important role in this process. Islam believed that at the Last Judgment, the body would be resurrected, and the state of preservation was crucial in ensuring that the soul of the deceased could be reunited with its creator in a dignified state. Embalming, therefore, was not just a matter of keeping the body intact, but rather a reflection of the desire to provide that body with the best possible for the afterlife. When the practice of embalming began to be more formalized in the early Islamic dynasties, it was intrinsically linked to the concept of purity and respect for the departed soul. Thus, the conservation of the body, whether by advanced techniques or by the simple use of natural elements such as natron, was seen as a form of honor to the deceased and their spiritual journey. Islamic communities, over the centuries, have sought to adapt and improve their funerary techniques with different regions and dynasties, bringing their own peculiarities to the process. For example, during the Abbasid period, the use of scented oils and aromatic resins, which became central elements in the preservation of the body, were considered indispensable. The theory behind this was simple. The body should be kept clean and fragrant as a sign of respect. However, the process was not always clean, and the odor emanating from the substances used during embalming was often unmistakable, resulting in a much stronger sensory experience than desired. But the impact of beliefs about death on the embalming process was not limited to the preservation of the body alone. The act of preparing the body also extended to the organization of funerary rituals and spiritual ceremonies. The ritual washing of the body, called ghusl, was an essential step in purifying the deceased before being cradled and buried. This was part of the consecration process that involved all aspects of death, where the body was not treated as something dirty or inferior, but as something sacred. For Muslims at the time, it was of utmost importance that the body be respected and treated with reverence, which in part explained the critical role that embalming played within this sacred ritual. The connection between body and soul was therefore straightforward. The body would not simply be discarded as a carcass, but should be treated with the utmost respect, preserving its qualities and allowing the soul to have a dignified place when it's separated from the material world. This link between body and soul, and its link to embalming practices, reflected the deep Islamic reverence for death and spiritual life, making death not an end, but a deeply spiritual and revered ritual. Now that you have an idea of the surrounding scenery, let's get to know the real heroes of this preservation story, the embalmers. These professionals, often with little or no formal medical training, were known for their almost mystical abilities in preserving bodies. However, their work was fraught with risk and extremely dangerous. Imagine being the person chosen to carry out a job that involved handling decomposing bodies, dealing with lethal chemicals, and facing the social stigma of being so intimately involved with death. Embalmers weren't exactly seen as people of high social standing. In fact, the opposite. As much as embalming was a highly requested service among the upper classes, the profession of embalmer was not glorified. They were treated with suspicion by the majority of society. Working with the human body, especially after death, was not exactly a job that attracted prestige or honor. However, these men, often referred to as mummifiers or corpse keepers, were essential in the process of preparing the body for the afterlife, and their skill was revered, albeit in secret. The risk involved in embalming work was considerable. The main substance used to embalm the bodies, natron, was highly caustic. Exposure to this substance could cause skin burns and even led to death if embalmers did not take the necessary care when handling it. Accidental ingestion of vapors or prolonged contact with the chemical compounds could be fatal, even if the embalmers knew they were risking their lives. The payment for this work, usually in the form of gold or monetary compensation, caused many to accept the danger. In addition, embalmers often worked in deplorable conditions, without the infrastructure and sanitary conditions we know today. The scorching heat and the lack of ventilation in the rooms where the bodies were preserved made the environment unbearable, and that's not to mention the unbearable odor of decomposing bodies, mixed with the strong smells of chemicals. Imagine being in a cramped space enveloped by these substances, knowing that your life was at constant risk. That was the price paid by embalmers to ensure that the body was preserved for the afterlife. The work was neither simple nor quick. It required hours, even days of incessant work. And in the end, the packaged body was not just a preserved piece of meat, but a symbol of respect and dedication to the memory of the deceased. For embalmers, it was a commitment to death, a tireless work of preservation, though the personal value of the profession was questionable. The embalmer was, in fact, a figure of occult importance, whose skills were necessary but rarely publicly appreciated. Let's take a more disturbing step now when we delve into the substances used in embalming. As I mentioned before, natron, a mixture of salts with a powerful dehydrating power, was the main substance used. However, this was just the tip of the iceberg. Embalming in Islamic history involved a number of chemicals and substances that, at first glance, may seem, well, a little deadly. The scented resins and oils, which were used to aromatize bodies and aid in preservation, often contained compounds so potent that they were dangerous to those who handled them. Embalmers, in an attempt to find the perfect formula to maintain the body, mixed various substances, many of which were toxic and could cause poisoning in large quantities. Resins derived from trees, for example, had antibacterial properties that helped slow down decomposition, but they were also incredibly strong and not exactly harmless. Over time, these substances could cause serious damage to the respiratory system and skin of embalmers. In addition, the use of scented oils, often derived from exotic plants and imported from distant lands, such as musk and amber, could be as intoxicating as it was intoxicating. Imagine the warmth in the environment and the feeling of saturation you would feel as the oils penetrated the air and skin, making the work even more exhausting and dangerous. And that's not to mention the use of products like mercury, which was used in some crops for preservation purposes. Mercury, with its highly toxic nature, was part of some embalming processes in some Islamic traditions, especially in older areas where medical and chemical knowledge was rudimentary. While mercury had the ability to slow down decomposition, it was also fatal if not handled with extreme care. Constant exposure to mercury caused serious long-term health problems, including chronic poisoning and irreversible damage to the nervous system. This leads us to question, why use such dangerous substances? The answer, like many others in history, was the search for the perfect, for a way to ensure that the body was preserved in a way that was worthy of the spiritual journey. But the cost of this process? The health and lives of the embalmers themselves were at stake, and this game was not without consequences. In the end, the use of these substances reflected the brutal and often overlooked reality of death in Islamic society. Embalming was not just a matter of preservation. It was a true test of endurance where the embalmer faced a life and death challenge, literally, in the name of funerary perfection. Now imagine that you are standing in the middle of the Arabian desert, where the heat is unbearable and the dry air seems to cut through your skin. The sun is relentless, and the feeling of heat is so intense that even breathing becomes an effort. In such an environment, the embalming process became even more complex, since the extreme climatic conditions of some Islamic regions required extra care in handling the bodies. Heat was, and still is, one of the main forces that dictated the rhythm and necessity of embalming. The relentless heat accelerated the decomposition of bodies, making conventional preservation methods essential to prevent the remains from turning into something unrecognizable before they were buried. It was not simply a matter of avoiding the stench of decomposition, but a matter of ensuring that the body was treated with the dignity it deserves, both in life and after death. In addition, the humidity of some regions also played a crucial role. Where heat was extreme, but moisture was also present, the decomposition process was accelerated even more. In cities like Baghdad, which during the height of the Abbasid Empire was a thriving metropolis, the combination of sweltering heat and humidity of the Tigris River was a real nightmare for embalmers. This meant that bodies exposed to these conditions began to wither and rot at an accelerated rate, requiring much more intensive methods of preservation. Here, the natron, mentioned earlier, became the hero. Its ability to dehydrate bodies and absorb moisture was vital. When embalmers applied natron to body cavities and around the skin, it helped dry out the body, preventing tissues from rotting prematurely. However, natron was not a simple or unchallenging solution. First of all, it had a strong, unpleasant smell, something that could probably only be tolerated by those who were deeply involved in the process. Imagine the difficulty of staying focused, dealing with heat, acidic smell, and humidity, while trying to preserve a human body. These climatic conditions not only influenced embalming techniques, but also the way Islamic society viewed death and funerary ritual. In many areas, the need to bury quickly due to heat was a priority, and embalming techniques were adjusted to meet this urgency. Even so, the process was never perfect. The heat and humidity in many cases ensured that the bodies were not preserved as completely as the embalmers wished, leaving the bodies more vulnerable to decomposition despite their efforts. In terms of contrast to what we know today, it makes us think about how advances in the preservation of bodies are almost always viewed positively. Today we have cold rooms and advanced technologies to preserve bodies much more effectively. But in the ancient Islamic world, the struggle against natural forces, such as heat and humidity, was a constant battle, where each body, before being buried, went through an arduous and unhealthy process of preservation. Now it's time for us to expand our comparison with ancient Egypt, perhaps the most famous example of embalming in history. Egyptian embalming is widely celebrated, being admired for the richness of the techniques and the belief that it allowed the dead to live eternally in a preserved body. However, when we compare Islamic practices with Egyptian ones, we can see that although both methods aim to ensure the preservation of the body, the approaches were drastically different, both in technique and philosophy. In Egypt, embalming was a refined and highly ceremonial practice. The body was completely stripped of its internal organs, which were removed and treated with salt, resins, and oils, and later stored in special jars known as canopic. The flesh of the body was covered with resins and bandages, and the mummification process could last several months. The tombs were incredibly elaborate, made to reflect the status of the deceased with the aim of creating a kind of eternal abode for the body. Egyptian embalming, therefore, was something grandiose, a work of art that ensured that the body was preserved for millennia. On the other hand, Islamic embalming, while similar in its intent to preserve the body, did not possess the same technical sophistication. There was no use of thin bandages or a detailed preservation of all the organs and tissues of the body. Instead, Islamic embalming was more focused on functionality than aesthetics or an artistic process. The removal of the internal organs, as I mentioned before, was common, but the focus was on ensuring that the body was fit for resurrection and final judgment, and not so much on meticulous preservation for eternity, as in the case of the Egyptians. While the Egyptians used several complex and long steps to ensure total preservation, the Islamists saw the body more as a temporary wrapping, something that needed to be cleansed and prepared for the transition of life to the afterlife. Islamic embalming, by comparison, did not involve the elaborate procedures of mummification, but rather the simple preservation of the body so that it would be suitable for the funerary ritual. The methods were simpler, less artistic, and often faster. The philosophy behind it was also different. In Egypt, mummification was linked to a deep desire to ensure that the deceased had a return to life, as a continuity of the physical world. The belief that the dead needed a perfect body for resurrection was central to the Egyptians. In Islam, the body was seen as something temporary, and the focus was more on spiritual preparation for the afterlife than on physical preservation. Embalming was not done to eternalize the body, but to ensure that it was suitable for the farewell and doomsday rituals. The difference between the two practices is a reflection on how different cultures and religions faced death and the preservation of the body. For the Egyptians, the body needed to be kept so that the spirit could continue its journey, but for the Muslims, the body was only a transient part of the spiritual journey, and embalming was a way to ensure that this body was respected at the time of death. Now that we've discussed the details of embalming, let's move on to burial practices and their impact on the body's preservation process. Burial in the Islamic context had great spiritual and religious importance and was deeply linked to embalming. Beliefs about the afterlife directly influenced how Muslims prepared their dead, both in terms of preserving the body and in terms of how it should be treated at the time of burial. In most Islamic traditions, the body of the deceased was wrapped in a simple fabric, often linen or cotton, without the luxury and adornments used by the Egyptians. The focus was on purity and simplicity, following the idea that when one dies, one would return to the Creator in the purest form possible. The body, therefore, was washed, anointed, and then wrapped in a white shroud. This process aimed to ensure that the deceased was treated with the utmost respect and dignity. But embalming, despite its focus on preservation, was not necessarily intended to ensure the continuity of the body in the same way that Egyptian mummifications were. After embalming, which involved simple preservation techniques, the body was taken to burial as soon as possible. This, by the way, was a striking feature of Islamic funerary practice. Haste. The quick burial reflects the Islamic belief that the body should be returned to the earth as soon as possible, because in the Islamic view, the body and soul were separated and should follow different paths. The act of burying the body immediately also had a significant spiritual component, as Islam advises that the body should be placed in the earth while it is still fresh, so that the deceased can be quickly integrated into the spiritual plane. The burial process followed a carefully structured ritual. The body was taken to the cemetery, where the funeral was celebrated with specific prayers. Once at the site, the body was placed in a simple hole, without much ornamentation or exaggeration, reflecting humility and respect for the deceased. In most Islamic traditions, the body would be placed on its side, with its face turned towards Mecca, a holy city for Muslims. Interestingly, the act of burying the body quickly did not refer only to the practical issue of avoiding decomposition. He was also closely linked to belief in the resurrection. Islam teaches that at the Last Judgment, all the dead will be resurrected, and the body will be reunited with the soul so that it can be judged. This explains the simplicity and pragmatism with which the body was treated after death. There was not an emphasis on long-term preservation, but on quick and respectful preparation for the spiritual transition. Embalming served more to ensure that the body did not deteriorate so quickly as to be unrecognizable at the time of burial. While the Egyptians cared for bodies for centuries, creating towering tombs and preserving their dead as if they were immortal heroes, Muslims of ancient times treated death in a much more pragmatic way. The goal was not to ensure that the body lived forever, but to ensure that the deceased was prepared for his or her encounter with God, that the body was returned to earth with dignity and respect, and that the spirit was taken to the afterlife. This difference in funerary practices reflects a fundamental distinction between the two cultures. While the Egyptians believed in the afterlife as a continuity of existence, the Muslims saw death as a transition to the eternal, where the body no longer had the same central role. And while both belief systems involved the preservation of the body, Islam was more concerned with ceremony and respect than with the eternal preservation of the physical body. At the heart of Islamic burial practices is a deeply spiritual view of the human body. For Muslims, the body was not seen only as a biological structure, but as a temporary loan given by God. The true essence of the human being, the soul, was what mattered in the end. The body, although treated with respect and dignity after death, was not considered eternal. The focus was not on preserving the flesh for millennia, but on ensuring that after death the deceased would be prepared for the spiritual journey. Unlike the Egyptians, who believed that the body should be preserved for eternity, the Muslims believed that the body should be purified, treated with humility, and ultimately returned to the earth. Death was seen not as a definitive end, but as a transition to eternal life where the body and soul would be separated until the Last Judgment. The Islamic concept of the afterlife is centered on the idea that the body is temporary, and that while the practices of embalming and preparation for burial were done with the greatest possible respect, death was not something to be avoided at all costs. The body should be treated with respect, but without the same obsession with preserving it forever that was seen in civilizations such as Egypt. The real importance lay in ensuring that the spirit of the deceased was ready for the afterlife. At the moment of death, the body was washed and anointed with perfumed oils, and the body was wrapped in a simple, unadorned shroud. The act of embalming, when performed, helped preserve the body long enough until burial, but the true preparation for the spiritual journey began with the purification of the spirit. The soul of the deceased, in Islam, was judged after death, and the body, although treated with respect, was not considered immortal. It was seen as a simple temporary vehicle for the soul. Islam also played a crucial role in how Muslims viewed death, as an opportunity to reflect on life and the acts committed. The body, unlike cultures that saw it as something sacred and eternal, was just a container that needed to be cleansed and purified. Caring for the body at the time of death was therefore a reflection of a greater respect for the soul, and the need to ensure that the spiritual journey of the deceased was done in the most dignified way possible. In contrast to other ancient cultures such as the Egyptian, which worshipped bodies and saw physical preservation as a means of achieving immortality, Islam taught that immortality came through the spirit. The body was merely a temporary passage. Thus, embalming and burial practices were not about preserving the body physically, but about ensuring that the spirit was prepared for what would come next, with the belief that at the Last Judgment, God would reunite the body and soul again, but this time for eternity. This view contrasted sharply with the Egyptian conception, where the body was central to the continuity of life after death. In Islam, death was seen more as a necessary closure to prepare for true eternal life. Embalming, therefore, was a necessary practice, but it was not an end in itself. The focus was on the transition from the body to the earth, while the spirit moved into a state of judgment. Now we come to one of the most intriguing parts of this embalming process, the use of perfumes. In many ancient cultures, perfumes were not only meant to please the senses, but they played a crucial role in spiritual rituals, and Islam was no different. The use of aromatic resins and oils had a profound meaning, going beyond simply masking the unpleasant smell of decomposition. In the Islamic context, perfumes were used to cleanse and purify, but also to project a spiritual message about death. When the bodies were prepared for burial, embalmers applied resins and scented oils, such as musk and amber, which were symbols of purity and elegance. Musk, for example, was highly prized and used in various funerary practices, including embalming. It was seen not only as a pleasantly sweet fragrance, but as a projection of what the deceased would become in the afterlife, a purified, ascending spirit. The use of perfumes not only involved an attempt to make the body more pleasant, but it was also a way of symbolically preparing the spirit for judgment. Perfumes also played a symbolic role in Islamic beliefs about death and the afterlife. They represented the idea that when dying, the body and soul should be treated with the utmost dignity, and the perfume helped to evoke a spiritual connection with the Creator. The fragrance became a symbol of the goodness of the deceased, the purity of the spirit, and of a journey that was about to begin. The act of anointing him with perfumed oils was thus a preparation for the resurrection, and not a mere attempt to adorn the corpse. However, this practice also makes us think about the limitations of the solutions used at the time. While perfume oils and resins helped with the preservation and embalming of the body, they were not permanent solutions as we might imagine with modern preservation techniques. Even with the use of these perfumes, the body began to decompose rapidly in the heat and humidity conditions, and the preservation process was rarely perfect. Still, the perfume was a symbolic gesture, reflecting Islamic society's attempt to immortalize the memory of the deceased in a way that transcended the physical. Now, if we compare it to modern practices, perfume and the use of fragrances in funeral rituals fall into disuse, as technology and preservation methods are much more advanced. However, the tradition of using fragrances in the ancient Islamic world highlights the difference between the beliefs of then and now. Today, we preserve the body with sophisticated scientific techniques, but in the past, perfume was the way to immortalize the essence of an individual. Although it cannot stop the decomposition, the aroma of musk and other resins was somehow an attempt to preserve the dignity of the deceased by reflecting what was considered most important, the spiritual preparation of the body. Today we use perfumes as a way to mark our identity or express our personality, but in the Islamic world of old, it was a tool to ensure that the deceased was prepared for the spiritual journey, rather than a simple cloaking device. While the embalming methods used in the ancient Islamic world were remarkably effective within the limitations of the time, the process faced a number of practical and technological challenges. Imagine yourself working in a hot, humid environment where time was against you and resources were limited. For embalmers, the biggest obstacle was the human body itself, which began to decompose soon after death. Decomposition was not just a biological process, it was a race against time, where every minute could mean the difference between good preservation and unrecognizable meat. Heat was, without a doubt, one of the greatest enemies of embalming. In the hottest regions of the Islamic world, such as the Middle East, the intense heat accelerated the process of decomposition, making embalming an even more difficult task. The use of natron to dry out bodies was effective to some extent, but the substance could not completely combat the effects of heat. In some regions, the practice of burying the body quickly was necessary to prevent it from decomposing even more quickly. Because of this, the embalming process was often rushed, with no guarantee that the body would be optimally preserved. In addition, access to resources such as natron, oils, and resins was not always guaranteed. The trade in these substances was not widely available to everyone, and the cost of acquiring them could be a major difficulty, especially for the lower classes. This meant that poorer families had less access to these methods of preservation, and the care of the bodies was in many cases much simpler, which resulted in a less reverent and often less effective burial. Another significant challenge was the lack of infrastructure to ensure that the body was treated in proper conditions. Embalmers often worked in unsanitary spaces, without access to adequate ventilation or hygienic conditions that could make the process safer. Imagine yourself inside a stuffy room handling dangerous chemicals and dealing with decomposing bodies. The lack of light and prolonged exposure to heat made the work even more challenging. And for embalmers, the risk of illness and infection was ever present, since constant handling of corpses could easily lead to exposure to pathogens. While the Egyptians had the advantage of a drier climate, which helped preserve bodies more effectively, Muslims living in wetter and warmer regions faced a real struggle against nature. In some areas, the embalming process proved ineffective in the long term, and the bodies, despite all the effort, were still beginning to decompose rapidly. This was in contrast to the modern view of preservation, where the use of cold storage and more advanced techniques ensure that bodies are preserved for long periods, often without concern for weather conditions. These challenges also reflected a darker reality. Embalming was often a futile task. Even with all the care taken, the human body could not be preserved forever. Basically, this reminds us that despite advances in techniques and science, the human body is still in the end a perishable structure, subject to the wear and tear of time. In the ancient Islamic world, as well as in the cultures that preceded it, embalming was more of a struggle against the inevitable than a definitive solution for preservation. Water and natron played crucial roles in Islamic embalming practices, but paradoxically, they were both allies and villains in the process of preserving bodies. Let's start with water, a common substance and, at the same time, essential for embalmers. When we talk about death in the Islamic context, water was seen not only as an element of cleansing, but as a symbol of purity. Before any other procedure, the body was thoroughly washed in water to remove any physical impurities. This washing ritual, known as ghusl, was a common practice in various Islamic cultures, with a strong spiritual component, as Islam believes that physical purification prepares the soul for the journey beyond. Water, however, also had a less benevolent role in the embalming process. Prolonged contact with water and humidity could accelerate the decomposition of the body. If the body was not sufficiently treated before being buried, the water could promote rotting, accelerating the decomposition process, especially in regions with warmer and more humid climates. In addition, water handling and body preparation could also become a challenge when considering hygiene difficulties and the lack of an ideal environment for work. And then comes natron. Natron was a salt compound, found mainly in Egypt, that had a remarkable ability to dehydrate and preserve. When applied to the body, natron helped dry out the corpse, drawing away moisture and slowing decomposition. At the same time, it acted as a primitive antibiotic, making it difficult for bacteria to grow that caused decomposition. Natron was undoubtedly the savior of Islamic embalming, but he also came with his own limitations. The problem with natron was that it was not a definitive solution. As effective as it was at dehydrating the body, it did not completely prevent decomposition over time, especially when compared to modern methods of preservation. Its effect lasted for a limited period, and the body was still subject to the natural forces of decomposition. The natron, as effective as it was in the short term, could not preserve the body for eternity, which brings to light an important reflection on the very concept of immortality in Islamic history. Although Islam did not seek the preservation of the body forever, as the Egyptians did, the use of substances such as natron reflected a desire to give the deceased the greatest possible respect before the final judgment. In addition, natron was also a scarce resource and access to it varied greatly depending on the region and period. In some parts of the Islamic world, natron was widely available and used abundantly, while in others its scarcity meant that embalmers had to make do with less effective alternatives. This availability factor also partly explained variations in embalming methods and inequalities in burial practices between the upper and lower classes. In many cases, embalmers did their best to maximize the effects of natron by applying it to body cavities and rubbing it along joints and skin. The application process was not delicate, and the sensation of the natron entering the crevices of the body was probably uncomfortable. But for embalmers, this assault on the body was necessary to ensure that the corpse was preserved long enough for the time until burial. When considering the importance of natron for preservation, it was impossible to ignore the paradox it represented, a substance that could save the body while accelerating the process of death, fulfilling its role in the cycle of life and death. One of the main beliefs that shaped the embalming process in Islam was the conception of the Last Judgment, a cosmic event in which all souls would be judged and the body resurrected. For Muslims, death was not an end, but a transition to a new phase of existence, and the body played an important role in this process. Although Islam did not have the same emphasis on the eternal preservation of the body as the Egyptians, the idea that the body would be resurrected at the Last Judgment gave embalming a raison d'être, even if temporary. The human body, in the Islamic understanding, was not simply discarded after death. He was considered the recipient of a divine soul and therefore worthy of respect, even though the afterlife was indeed a spiritual matter. Embalming, while seen as necessary to ensure that the body was preserved sufficiently for burial, also had a deep symbolism attached to the belief in the resurrection. For Muslims, the body was temporary, but the soul was eternal, and the body would be reunited with the soul at the time of the Last Judgment. In the Islamic view, the body should be treated with dignity so that, at the resurrection, the deceased could present himself before God in a respectful and honorable manner. This idea was linked to the concept of purity, in which the body, after death, needed to be cleansed of any impurity that could compromise its dignity. The embalmers, therefore, were not only preserving the body for the display or cultivation of a physical immortality, but to ensure that it was ready for resurrection, when it would be called to life again for divine judgment. It is important to note that in Islam, the body is not seen as an end in itself. The body, with all its defects and imperfections, was considered a transitory part, something temporary that would be left behind when the soul separated from it. True life took place in the soul, and the body only accompanied the soul until the moment of death. The Last Judgment, therefore, was not only a matter of assessing the physical state of the body, but also an opportunity for the soul to be judged and, based on its actions, to be rewarded or punished. While the Egyptians mummified their bodies with the intention of ensuring a physical, eternal life in the afterlife, in Islam the focus was on spiritual purification. Embalming did not seek to preserve the body for millennia, but to ensure that it was adequately prepared for the encounter with the Creator. For the Egyptians, the preserved body was a key to the afterlife. For Muslims, it was more a matter of respect and preparation for the spiritual judgment that would come later. In practice, this meant that Islamic embalming was often a less elaborate process than the Egyptian one. There was no search for the eternal preservation of the body, but the preparation for the resurrection. The body was treated with respect, but its role was only one in passing as a temporary vessel for the soul that would continue its journey into eternity. This generated a sense of acceptance of death in a more pragmatic way. Death was a transition, not an end that had to be avoided at all costs. Now let's explore another fascinating aspect of Islamic embalming: the use of plants and herbs in the preservation process. While some ancient cultures, such as the Egyptian, relied heavily on sophisticated resins and chemicals, Islamic embalmers also turned to plants, utilizing their natural properties to complement the preservation of the body and give spiritual meaning to death. In Islam, plants and herbs were not only tools for preserving the body physically, but they were also seen as spiritual agents that helped purify the soul. Some herbs were used to aromatize bodies, others to protect against disease, while still others were used for their healing and symbolic properties. Among the most common were aloe vera, sandalwood, and myrrh. These plants had deep spiritual and symbolic meanings. For example, myrrh was considered a symbol of purity and spiritual strength. Its application to the body of the deceased not only helped to preserve the flesh, but was also a symbolic gesture, representing the purity of the soul that was about to embark on its journey to the afterlife. The use of plants was not limited to embalming itself. Often, the herbs and fragrant oils were applied even before death, as part of purification rituals that began soon after death. The use of sandalwood oil, for example, was common not only for embalming, but also for anointing the body of the deceased during the funeral ceremony, as a way to protect it and prepare it for spiritual transition. In addition to their role in funeral ceremonies, herbs also had deeper symbolism. They were seen as gifts from nature, given by God to help protect the body and soul during the process of death and resurrection. The use of these plants reflected a belief that just as plants were sources of healing and protection in life, they could also play an important role in preparing the body for death. In many Islamic traditions, there was a belief that certain plants had the power to intercede on behalf of the soul of the deceased, helping them to gain a smooth passage to eternal life. However, when comparing it with modern embalming techniques, we see that the use of herbs was, as symbolic as it was, far less effective in preserving the body than current methods. Today, modern medicine allows us to preserve bodies with cooling and chemical embalming techniques, keeping them almost untouched for a long period of time. In contrast, the plants and herbs used by the ancient Muslims had a temporary effect, and bodies, even treated with the most careful applications, inevitably decomposed over time. This leads us to reflect on how different cultures have approached death and the preservation process. For Muslims of antiquity, death was a natural part of life, and the use of herbs and plants in embalming reflected an attempt to respect this transition with the use of natural gifts. There was not an obsession with preserving the body forever, but rather an attempt to respect the spirituality of the deceased and ensure that their soul could make its way to doomsday. As the Islamic Empire expanded, the elite, made up of caliphs, nobles, and religious leaders, began to view embalming in a much more solemn and elaborate way. But, as might be expected, the process of preserving and burying the bodies of the powerful distanced itself from the treatment of the lower classes. As in many other cultures, the preservation of the royal body became a demonstration of status, but it also reflected a desire to ensure that society's most important figures would have a good death, a death that reflected their worth and social standing. For the caliphs and other members of the Islamic nobility, death was not just a personal event, but a public and political one. The body of a caliph, for example, not only needed to be treated with great respect and dignity, but it also needed to be preserved in a way that reflected its spiritual and political importance. This included the use of more refined embalming methods, with greater access to resources such as perfumes and expensive oils, which were not available to the average citizen. In addition, royal bodies were often buried in monumental tombs, which also served to perpetuate the power and authority of the deceased person. In some dynasties, such as that of the Ottoman Empire, the process of preserving royal bodies was treated with special reverence. For example, Ottoman caliphs were often buried with great ceremony, and their bodies were embalmed with more advanced techniques, with the use of aromatic substances to ensure that they were presentable during public display and funeral. These bodies were generally not buried in a simple way, as was the case with the lower classes. Rather, they were accompanied by elaborate prayer rituals and ceremonies, with many ornaments and valuable objects surrounding them, reflecting their high status. While the embalming of the upper classes was more elaborate, the treatment of the body of a caliph or political leader also reflected the Islamic belief that all bodies, regardless of their social standing, were equally worthy of respect at death. However, the treatment and preservation of the bodies of the powerful contrasted with the simple conditions of the lower classes, who often did not have the same spiritual or material care after death. For them, quick burial and basic preservation were enough, as the focus was on ensuring that the soul went on its way, regardless of the physical condition of the body. It also leads us to reflect on the inequalities that have always existed in funerary practices, not only in the Islamic world, but in many ancient cultures. Death was often an opportunity to reflect one's social position, and while nobles could be buried with wealth, care, and respect, the lower classes were often neglected. For the upper classes, embalming and the process of preserving the body became, in a way, an extension of their power and influence, even after death. This contrast between the care of real bodies and the bodies of the poor also reflects differences in beliefs about death and preservation, which were ultimately determined by each individual's social position. Death, in many senses, was a continuation of social life, and the way the body was treated was a reflection of the value attributed to the individual in life. As the Islamic Empire spread, the view of the human body and its preservation also underwent a transformation. In the beginning, embalming was a primary practice with the aim of ensuring that the bodies of the dead were treated with due respect and were ready for the final judgment. However, over the centuries, more elaborate and innovative practices emerged, such as body sculpture, which was a more aesthetic and symbolic way of preserving the memory of the deceased, especially among the elite. Body carving, while not as prevalent as Egyptian mummification techniques, began to gain prominence in the wealthier Muslim regions and the courts of the caliphs. The body of an important person, instead of being preserved in a practical way, could be represented through sculptures and images. These depictions were made with great attention to detail, and the human body was carved from marble or stone to create a physical memory of the deceased, perpetuating their image after death. These carvings were not only a way to honor the dead, but they also had deep spiritual value. They represented the continuity of the person in the material world, even after his departure. Sculpture in this context had a symbolic meaning of eternity, being a way to ensure that the deceased had a permanent place in the memory of society, especially among the noble class. It was an idealized representation of the body, where the natural decay of the flesh was transformed into an immortal image of perfection. But this transformation from the preservation of bodies to sculpture also reveals something deeper about how Islamic society dealt with death. For the elites, the human body ceased to be just a mortal vessel and became a symbol of status and immortality through art. This movement reflected a desire for transcendence, no longer simply to preserve the body physically, but to create an eternal image of greatness. However, for the lower classes, sculpture was never an option. Basic embalming and rapid burial were still the most common practices, and the notion of an idealized representation of the body was something far removed from the reality of many people. The contrast between the carving of the real bodies and the more humble treatments of the popular classes reveals once again the deep social inequalities that existed in life and death, and how the death of an important person could be celebrated very differently from the death of an ordinary person. This transition from embalming practices to body sculpting reflects a shift in perceptions about the human body and its importance after death. The body, previously considered an object to be preserved for the final judgment, now also came to be seen as an object of art, worthy of being immortalized. This practice began to gain traction, particularly during the period of the caliphs and in royal courts, where the death of a leader meant an opportunity to assert the power and authority of that individual, even after his departure. Thus, the body and death, which were once treated with a more pragmatic and spiritual approach, began to be, as well, forms of artistic and political exhibition. The death of a caliph or nobleman became not only a spiritual transition, but an opportunity to celebrate the figure of the deceased through art, perpetuating their memory in the form of detailed and elaborate sculptures. Embalming and burial practices in the Islamic world were not just spiritual or cultural rituals. They also had a strong impact on social relations and hierarchy within society. The way the body was treated after death reflected the social position of the deceased in life, and these practices served to reinforce the social inequalities already present. Death, contrary to what it might seem, did not level all individuals, but in fact accentuated the differences between classes. For members of the elite, caliphs, rulers, nobles, and influential religious, the embalming and burial process was much more elaborate. As discussed earlier, these individuals were buried with greater ceremony, with greater care in the preservation of their bodies, and with rituals that reflected their superior status. The use of expensive perfumes, rare substances such as natron, and the care to ensure that the body was preserved in a manner worthy of the final judgment not only reflected respect for the person, but also highlighted the political and social importance of the deceased. On the other hand, the lower classes who lacked the resources or the necessary social standing received much simpler funeral treatment. Embalming, if performed, was rudimentary, with the use of limited resources. Burial was quick, and the body did not receive the same attentions or ornamental rituals. This created a clear distinction between the rich and the poor, with burial practices serving to further reinforce social barriers. The impact of these practices on the social hierarchy was not limited to the treatment of the body after death, but also extended to the way families and communities dealt with death. In upper-class families, the funeral was a great public occasion, an opportunity to show respect and social status, and also to ensure that the legacy of the deceased was perpetuated in a visible and impressive way. For the poorest, however, death was a silent event without great ceremonies or public displays. The lack of resources and prestige meant that the funeral often passed without much fanfare, reflecting the social invisibility of those who departed. In addition, the way embalmers were seen was also related to hierarchy. As we mentioned before, embalmers, while essential, were often marginalized, not enjoying the same status or respect as other professionals, such as doctors or religious leaders. Death work was associated with impurity and dirty work, which reflected an even deeper social division. In a society where death was considered taboo and a constant reminder of human limitations, embalmers were in an uncomfortable position between the necessity of their work and the social contempt for the work they performed. This phenomenon was not unique to Islam, but it was reflected in many cultures throughout history. Death, far from being an equalizer, often accentuated social inequalities, making visible the status and class of the deceased, even after his or her departure. Funerary practices thus became an extension of social hierarchy, a reflection of the way classes were treated in life and how their social position was perpetuated after death. In the end, death in the Islamic world, as in other cultures, did not serve to erase the differences between the classes. On the contrary, it made these differences even more visible, with funerary practices acting as a mirror of society, reflecting the divisions and inequalities that existed in life. Death does not level everyone, but reinforces the barriers that are already established. Before we get into the embalming rituals themselves, there is a fundamental aspect of Islamic funerary practices that deserves to be highlighted: the purification of the body. Islam, like many religions, places great emphasis on cleansing and purification, especially at the time of death. The central idea is that in order for the soul of the deceased to have the best possible opportunity for the journey after death, the body should be clean, both physically and spiritually. The process of cleansing the body, called ghusl, was performed shortly after death and was a key part of the funerary ritual. The body of the deceased was washed, usually by family members or a specialist, with water, soap, and, in many cases, aromatic substances. Cleanliness was not just a matter of hygiene, it was also a spiritual ritual, intended to purify the body so that it could be prepared for the next phase of spiritual life. Ghusl reflected the Islamic belief that after death, the body needed to be treated with the same respect and dignity that was given during life, so that the soul could be led to its final destination in a dignified manner. Unlike other ancient cultures, such as the Egyptians, who treated the body as a kind of vessel that should be preserved for millennia, Islam saw death as a natural and necessary transition. The purification of the body was part of this transition process, a way to ensure that the deceased was prepared for the final judgment and eventually eternal life. While embalming and preservation of the body were important, the cleansing ritual reflected Islam's priority on ensuring that the body was clean and ready to be buried. After ghusl, the body was wrapped in a simple shroud, usually of white cloth, without any ornamentation or decoration. The simple shroud symbolized humility, reflecting the Islamic belief that everyone, rich or poor, was equal before God. The simplicity of the dress, as well as the speed with which the body was buried, reflected a view of death as a transitory phase, rather than something that should be embalmed in order to perpetuate a material existence. This contrast with other cultures is interesting. While the Egyptians, for example, mummified their dead to ensure that the bodies were ready for the afterlife, an attempt to preserve the physique forever, Islam approached death in a more pragmatic way. The body was treated with respect, but the focus was on the preparation of the soul, not on physical preservation. Embalming, if performed, served to ensure that the body was ready for burial and resurrection, but not for the immortality of the body. In practice, cleansing the body with water was essential not only for the health and well-being of the deceased, but also to comply with the religious norms of Islam. Purification helped to separate the body from the material world, marking its transition to the spiritual plane. In a way, the cleansing of the body functioned as a farewell to earthly life, preparing the soul for the judgment that would come after death. This rite of purification also symbolized the return to the Creator, where the body, once part of a mundane existence, would now be left behind, returned to the earth from which it came. These cleansing and purification rituals have a direct parallel to the core beliefs of Islam, which highlight the transience of life and the importance of spiritually preparing for death. The human body, while temporary, needed to be treated with respect and dignity. but the real emphasis was on the purification of the soul. This leads us to reflect on how, in many cultures, death is not just the end of life, but a transformation. A transformation that, in the case of Islam, required the body to be cleansed, purified, and prepared for what would come after. As the bodies were prepared and buried, many superstitions arose about the process of decomposition. In fact, decomposition was not only a biological issue, but also a spiritual issue. And in the Islamic world, as in many other cultures, there were many beliefs about what happened to the body after death. In some regions, the simple act of burying it was surrounded by rituals designed to ensure that the body did not decompose in the wrong way, or that it would not be corrupted by outside forces. Decomposition itself was seen as a natural and inevitable phenomenon, but many believed that it was possible to delay this process or even prevent certain aspects of it through religious and spiritual practices. One of the biggest fears that roamed people's minds was the idea that the body could be desecrated after death. Superstitions often included the belief that evil spirits or unseen forces could interfere with the decomposition process, corrupting the body irreversibly. There was a fear that if the body was not properly packed or buried, it could be contaminated or possibly possessed. This idea generated great anxiety among families, who wanted to ensure that their loved ones were buried in a safe and dignified manner. However, decomposition was not only feared for the deterioration of the body, but also for the possible spiritual consequences. In Islam, it was believed that the decomposition of the body, if not handled properly, could reflect negatively on the soul of the deceased. Decomposition was seen as a process of corruptibility, something that could be understood as a form of punishment or a reflection of the individual's life of sin. For this reason, embalming and burial rituals had a preventive component to ensure that the body was not seen as corrupt, and that, when buried, it was respected so that the soul could move on to the final judgment. Superstitions also surrounded the question of the body's return to earth. Many people believed that certain bodies, especially those of individuals who were considered unclean or who had lived lives of sin, could decompose more quickly or more visibly as a way to manifest their inner impurity. This fear of visible and therefore spiritual decomposition increased the fear of death and led to an obsession with preservation and embalming. Over time, as the understanding of the physical decomposition of the body became more scientific, these superstitions began to lose strength. However, the religious view that death and the body should be treated with dignity remained, and the idea of ensuring that the body was properly prepared for the spiritual journey still remains a fundamental practice within Islam. Although decomposition is a natural process, the fear of spiritual forces and the desire to ensure that the body was preserved in a clean and dignified manner still persists in many funerary rituals around the world. Ultimately, decomposition, while inevitable, is treated as something much more than a simple biological process. For Muslims in antiquity, and for many still today, it had a spiritual dimension, reflecting beliefs about purity, sin, and the journey of the soul. In Islam, as in other religions, the body and soul were seen as intertwined, and death was a time of reflection, care, and preparation, not only for the body but also for the soul that would move on. In Islam, as in many other religious traditions, death is not seen as a definitive end, but as a transition to a new phase of existence, where the soul of the deceased is judged and follows its eternal destiny. Death, therefore, is not something to be feared, but a natural event that is part of the cycle of life, where the body and soul separate. The embalming and burial process in Islam reflects this view that death is only a part of the path, a rite of passage into eternity. The concept that the soul continues after death is central to Islam. For Muslims, death is seen as a passage to the final judgment, where each soul will be judged based on their actions during life. The body, while worthy of respect and care, is only a temporary vessel for the soul, which is the true focus of the afterlife. This differentiates Islam from other cultures, such as Egyptian, where the body was preserved as part of an effort to ensure the physical continuity of life after death. In the embalming process, the intention was to prepare the body so that it would be worthy to be buried and to continue its spiritual journey. The body did not need to be preserved for eternity, as in the case of the Egyptians, but it had to be treated with respect and dignity to ensure that the deceased could move on to the next phase of their existence without hindrance. In many cases, the ritual of purification and the simplicity of burial reflected the belief that, after death, the body no longer had an active role, with the soul being the true focus. Death rituals in Islam, such as the washing of the body, ghusl, the application of perfumes and resins, and the quick burial, had a deep spiritual charge. Each act was loaded with symbolism, representing both physical and spiritual preparation. Death, then, was not an end, but a preparation for what was to come after, where the soul would undergo a divine judgment and continue its eternal journey. In contrast to other cultures, where the body was preserved with the intention of maintaining physical continuity after death, Islam places the soul at the center of the post-death process. The body is treated with respect and care, but its primary role is to serve as a vehicle for the soul until it departs. The preservation of the body is thus a part of the rite of passage, but not its ultimate goal. Instead of seeking physical immortality, the focus is on spiritual purification and preparation for what is to come. This spiritual understanding of death also reflects a view of acceptance and humility. Death is a natural part of human existence, and preparing the body for burial is a way of respecting this process, without attempting to avoid or fight the inevitability of the end. The simplicity of Islamic embalming and burial is in many ways a reflection of this acceptance. Death is not something to be feared or avoided, but something to be accepted with respect, in preparation for the soul's eternal journey. As Islam spread across the world, from the Arabian Peninsula to North Africa, Central Asia, and beyond, burial practices also evolved and diversified. The presence of Islamic empires such as the Umayyads, Abbasids, and Ottomans not only amplified religious influence, but also brought new perspectives on how death and embalming should be treated, adjusting traditional practices according to the new times and the new territories that Islam conquered. The first major impact came with the expansion of burial practices to different regions with diverse climates and cultures. In more arid areas, such as the Middle East, bodies were naturally more susceptible to rapid decomposition due to extreme heat, which led to adaptations in preservation techniques and a greater use of substances such as natron and resins. In wetter regions, such as the areas of North Africa and Asia Minor, humidity meant that preservation techniques needed to be adjusted, and the use of oils and perfumes with antibacterial properties became more common, helping to slow down decomposition more effectively. However, the main influence of the Islamic empires was not so much innovation in techniques, but the spread of a spiritual and philosophical view of death and the body, which permeated all aspects of Muslim life. The conception that death was a spiritual transition, and not a definitive end, was widely adopted, and with it, embalming was transformed. While in early times the preservation of the body had a utilitarian function, with the growth of the Islamic Empire, death and the body came to be more deeply associated with spiritual rituals, with greater emphasis on the preparation of the soul than on the body. In the Ottoman Empire, for example, the funeral parlor became a reflection of imperial grandeur. Ottoman caliphs and sultans were buried in elaborate mausoleums known as turbas, which served as spaces of memory and veneration. These sites were not just graves. They were living monuments that celebrated the power and importance of rulers. The body, despite its transience, gained a symbolism that transcended death, reflecting the desire to immortalize the ruler's legacy through architecture and the cult of his memory. Although the embalming process was relatively simple, the grandeur of the burial reflected the status of the deceased. On the other hand, the practice of burying quickly and simply, as taught in the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, continued to be the norm for most Muslims, especially among the popular classes. This practice reflected Islam's emphasis on the equality of all before God. Death, in the Islamic view, did not discriminate against class or wealth, and the last journey of any Muslim should be equally simple and respectful, without exaggeration or ostentation. Thus, Islamic empires, while respecting traditional preservation and burial practices, also helped to consolidate a view of the body and death that was deeply rooted in spiritual values. Although the body was treated with respect, the focus was always on preparing the soul for the final judgment. Embalming, in its simplest form, was part of a rite of passage that did not seek eternal preservation, but rather the dignity of the deceased when facing the afterlife. Islamic spirituality thus transformed funerary practices into an affirmation of faith and devotion, And over time, embalming and burial techniques were shaped not only by practical needs, but also by the understanding that death was a process of transition into eternity. This philosophy, which persists to this day, became a central part of funerary traditions throughout the Islamic world. The arrival of the Crusades in the 11th and 12th centuries brought with it a series of changes in Islamic funerary practices, as well as in many other traditions of different cultures. Although the main focus of the Crusades was religious and territorial struggle, the interaction between Christians and Muslims also provoked a clash of cultural and religious practices, which inevitably affected the approaches to embalming and death. The Christian military presence in Muslim lands exposed Muslims to new ways of looking at death and the body, while also causing Muslims to influence the funerary practices of the Crusaders in subtle but noticeable ways. During the period of the Crusades, the city of Jerusalem, which was of great importance to both Muslims and Christians, became a point of convergence of the funerary practices of these two great religions. Christians, who were accustomed to burying their dead in churches and holy sites, began to come across Islamic burial practices, with their focus on simplicity, respect, and speed of burial. To many crusaders, the idea of a quick and unostentatious burial seemed shocking, in contrast to their own more elaborate burial practices and more pompous ceremonies. On the other hand, Muslims were also forced to confront the different ways of dealing with death that Christians brought with them. Many of the corpses of the Crusaders killed in the battles were buried quickly and without traditional Islamic rituals, which generated some discomfort among Muslims. However, over time, there has been a cultural exchange and, in some cases, even an adoption of new practices, or at least a greater awareness of the funeral practices of adversaries. While embalming techniques did not change drastically due to the Crusades, beliefs about death, the body, and the afterlife were definitely impacted by this period of conflict. The Crusades also brought with them an increase in cultural interactions between the Christian West and the Muslim East, creating an exchange of knowledge and practices. This extended to medicine and funerary rituals, with Muslims sharing some of their body preservation techniques with Christians. While Christians were still far from adopting the Egyptian method of mummification, the Islamic embalming process influenced certain Western practices. The preservation of the body was not a priority in Christian religions during the Crusades, but conversations between the two cultures began to make Christians more interested in body preservation practices. In addition, the Crusades resulted in a number of political and social changes that affected funeral rituals. With the fall of Jerusalem to Christians, many Muslim burial sites were desecrated or abandoned, and this generated a sense of loss among Muslims. The impact of this on funeral practices was significant, as Islamic communities were forced to adapt their ways of dealing with death, seeking to preserve rituals and respect the bodies of the deceased at a time of great instability. Political and military uncertainties caused a reinterpretation of funerary traditions, with a greater focus on ensuring that, despite raids and looting, the dignity of the deceased was preserved. While the Crusades were undoubtedly a period of great conflict, they also functioned as a meeting point between Muslim and Christian cultures, especially as it pertained to death and burial practices. Islamic embalming practices did not change dramatically during this period, but the cultural impact of the Crusades helped shape a new way of looking at death and the body in the context of war, religion, and the interconnectedness between civilizations. Throughout Islamic history, the relationship between the body and the soul has always been central to beliefs about life and death. Islam, like many other religions, conceives of death as a separation of the physical body and the soul, the latter being seen as eternal and immortal. The body, in turn, is temporary, and its role is to serve as a dwelling place for the soul, while the person is alive. At the moment of death, this connection breaks down, and the body returns to the land from which it came, while the soul goes on what Islam describes as a spiritual journey that will culminate in the Last Judgment. The body, although respected and treated with dignity after death, does not have the same religious importance as the soul. Embalming, burial, and rituals associated with death are done not to ensure the immortality of the body, but to prepare the soul for its transition to eternal life. The separation of body and soul is seen as a natural part of the cycle of life, and death rituals reflect the acceptance of this separation. The practice of embalming in Islam, therefore, has a deep spiritual significance. By embalming the body, Muslims were not trying to preserve material life, but to ensure that the deceased was treated with due respect and dignity. The focus was on giving the deceased a respectful farewell, so that his soul could move in peace to the afterlife. Unlike other cultures, such as the Egyptian, where the preservation of the body was seen as a way to ensure the continuity of life after death, Islam did not see the body as something that should be eternalized. True immortality was in the soul, not in the flesh. This philosophy about the body and soul is reflected in funerary rituals. The ritual washing of the body, known as ghusl, is one of the first steps in the process of preparing for death. Water, which is seen as a purifying element, is used to cleanse the body before it is wrapped in a simple shroud. This act of purification is not only physical, but spiritual. By washing the body, Islam teaches that one is cleansed of one's impurities, and one's soul is ready to move on to the next world. It is a symbolic separation between earthly life and spiritual journey. Respect for the body is also reflected in the way Muslims treat the dead. Even if the body is temporary, it is seen as a loan from God, and therefore should be treated with dignity. However, the body is not eternalized as an icon of veneration. The soul of the deceased is the main focus, and the body serves as a preparation for that soul to have a smooth passage to the Last Judgment, where it will be judged by its actions in life. This makes death in Islam not an event of mourning or despair, but a transition to a higher spiritual stage. This separation of body and soul is also linked to the idea that the body should not be attached as something immutable. Islam teaches that death is inevitable and natural, and that the body, no matter how worthy of respect, will return to earth. The spirit, in turn, will continue its journey. Thus, death is seen as a necessary closure to the cycle of life, and embalming and funeral rituals ensure that this closure is respectful, but without the obsession with preserving the body indefinitely. Ultimately, this view of the body and soul in Islam makes us reflect on the transience of life and the importance of the soul in the spiritual journey. The body, which was treated with so much respect during life, is now prepared for separation, and the soul moves towards the Last Judgment. This duality between body and soul, between the physical and the spiritual, is a fundamental feature of Islamic funerary practices, and shows how death is not an end but a passage to the afterlife. As Islam expanded and the centuries passed, burial and embalming practices adapted to modern times, maintaining respect for traditions, but also embracing the changes brought about by science and the advancement of medical techniques. Traditional embalming, with its focus on the use of natron, resins, and oils, has been largely replaced by more modern methods of preservation and burial, reflecting the evolution of burial practices over time. The main change in modern burial practices has been the introduction of more advanced preservation methods, such as the use of cold storage and chemical embalming techniques. These new techniques allowed the preservation of bodies for long periods, overcoming the limitations of traditional dehydration and drying methods. This brought about a significant change in the way the body was treated after death, providing greater control over decomposition, especially in areas with warmer climates. Despite these innovations, the fundamental philosophy behind Islamic burial has remained unchanged. Death is a natural transition, and the body, as much as it deserves respect, is temporary. The focus remains on caring for the soul and preparing for the Last Judgment, not on the eternal preservation of the body. Respect for the simplicity and dignity of the deceased remains a central feature of Islamic burial practices. In many parts of the Islamic world, burial still follows traditional rituals of speed and simplicity, with bodies being buried quickly and with minimal ostentation. The practice of wrapping the body in a simple shroud and burying it without elaborate embalming is still the norm for most Muslims. However, in more developed urban areas, where access to modern preservation techniques is more common, it is possible to see the use of cold storage and other preservation methods, which allow the body to be preserved for longer until burial can take place according to traditional practices. This transition from traditional to modern methods reflects in some ways the way Muslim societies balance the preservation of their cultural and religious traditions with advances in science and technology. The modernization of funerary practices, however, does not mean a departure from spiritual beliefs. The embalming and preparation of the body for burial, although now more technical, continue to reflect respect for the body and soul of the deceased, maintaining the idea that the body, although temporary, deserves to be treated with the greatest possible dignity. In terms of modern burial practices, Islam has also adapted to the changing needs of contemporary societies, but without losing sight of the principle that death is a transition to eternal life. While technology and new preservation techniques offer advantages in terms of preserving the body, the focus is still on ensuring that the soul is prepared for what comes after death. The modernization of burial, therefore, has not altered the Islamic view of death as a natural and spiritual transition, but has offered new means to ensure that this process is treated with respect and dignity. Ultimately, the transition to modern burial practices in Islam demonstrates how traditions can evolve without losing their spiritual roots. Although preservation techniques and burial methods have changed over the centuries, respect for death, body, and soul remains the cornerstone of Islamic burial practices, reflecting the belief that death is not the end, but a preparation for the eternal. As we look back at ancient Islamic burial practices, we are reminded of how spiritual traditions and beliefs shaped the way death was treated in Muslim societies. According to the Islamic view, death was never an end, but a transition to something more important, the resurrection and the final judgment. The body, therefore, was treated with respect and dignity, but always with the understanding that its true essence, the soul, would continue its journey, transcending physical death. In ancient times, embalming and burial practices reflected this view of death as a spiritual transition. Embalming, simple and pragmatic, served to ensure that the body was preserved in a dignified way until burial, but it did not aim at the perpetuation of physical life, as seen in other cultures. True immortality was in the soul, and the body was only a temporary vehicle. This philosophy was reflected in the process of cleansing the body, the use of natural substances such as natron and herbs, and the speed with which the body was buried, reflecting the belief that the soul should be freed without delay. With the arrival of modern burial practices and the incorporation of new technologies, such as cold rooms and chemical embalming, the issues of body preservation have changed. However, the philosophy behind Islamic funeral rituals has remained unchanged. The body is treated with respect, but death is not something to be feared or artificially prolonged. Islam, unlike some ancient cultures that sought the eternal preservation of the body, views the body as transient and not essential to the afterlife. The changes in contemporary funeral practices, therefore, are more an adaptation to the new realities than a modification of core spiritual values. Today, when we look at these practices and reflect on contemporary morality, we are reminded that while science and technology can give us more control over death, the essence of death and the body remains the same. Respect for death, the soul, and the body remains the foundation of Islamic philosophy. In a modern world where death is often treated with detachment and even fear, Islamic traditions invite us to see death not as an end, but as a natural stage of existence, something to be accepted with dignity and respect. Reflecting on these practices also makes us think about our own beliefs about death and immortality. In contemporary society, we often see death as a taboo, something to be avoided or neglected. However, the Islamic view reminds us that death, with all its complexities and mysteries, is part of a natural and spiritual cycle, where the body is respected, but the soul is the true focus. And perhaps as we reflect on how Muslims of other eras dealt with death, we can learn to approach death with more serenity, understanding, and respect. Ultimately, Islamic burial practices, both ancient and modern, teach us that the body is not the end, but a means, and that true immortality is in the spirit. With this in mind, we can face death not with fear or anxiety, but with the peace of knowing that it is only a passage to the afterlife, where the soul continues its eternal journey.